You're listening to Honestly Mental, the podcast, and I'm your host, Erica Diaz. I'm a wife, a mama, a woman in leadership, but y'all, I'm a perfectly imperfect human. I have depression, PTSD, and generalized anxiety disorder, and I am figuring it out every single day. It's really been quite the journey, so this podcast aims to provide a raw and authentic approach to several issues surrounding mental health. Through the lens of our guests and I, we will provide insight into how we navigated our own challenges through honest and vulnerable conversation. We are building a community of individuals committed to changing the world one conversation, one person at a time. We are raising awareness by destigmatizing mental health through continuing the conversation. We are providing hope and ultimately have a goal of saving the lives of those who may be feeling dark and alone. On today's episode, I am joined by the fabulous Rocki Howard. Rocki and I met several months ago at a conference and were able to spend a lot of time together. And she has just been such a source of inspiration and hope and is a fabulous mentor and also friend. I'm so excited to have her here, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about her. She is the founder of Diversiology and the host of the Grown Woman Life podcast, which brings together bold, brilliant, badass women in the workplace and goes over life lessons in leadership as well. Rocki is a tenured diversity and talent acquisition strategist with lean, project management, and HR certifications. On top of that, Rocki was also the 2022 and 2023 diversity influencer through Staffing Industry Analysts, as well as one of SIA's Global 150 Women in Staffing for 2023. She is an advisory board member for Wedge HR and Informed Decisions, a member of the Forbes HR Council, and has been featured in talent outlets such as HR Executive. And Rocki, could you help me out with this other piece that you've been part of?
And ERE.
ERE. And she has been featured on ABC News, multiple podcasts, and has been a featured speaker, panelist, and influencer on the topic of DEIB, including events such as SIA's Executive Forum and CWS, SourceCon, HR Tech, Talent Acquisition Week, and Hacking HR. She is a proud over 40 Black Christian wife and mom who prioritizes being a voice for diversity and helping small to mid-sized business leaders to create high-performing, engaged, and inclusive work cultures. She believes we change the world one story, one conversation, and one action at a time. And how amazing is it to have you on this podcast doing just that? So welcome, Rocki.
Well, I think you're doing just that. I'm so excited to be here. I'm so proud of what you're doing. We need to be more honest. We need more honesty about our mental health, and we do need to destigmatize it. And you will change lives. One story, one conversation here. And I'm hoping people can take one action away that will help them. So I'm so honored to be here.
Well, thank you. And so today we're going to be talking about your experience with postpartum depression as well as generalized anxiety disorder. So what I thought would be best is, to really go over some of the statistics in the United States, which are really kind of wild and just another reason why it's necessary that we're having these conversations. So as it relates to postpartum depression, the stats say that anywhere between 1 in 7 to 10 women experience postpartum depression. But they also think that the number could be significantly higher because of the amount of individuals who never actually seek out help. There are some risk factors, of course. If you've had it before, you're 50% more likely to have it again. And if you are somebody who was, physically abused at some point in your life or has major depressive disorder and kind of those additional elements, if you will, we'll call them, you're 71% more likely to experience postpartum depression. So, a lot of people are aware of postpartum depression as it relates to the baby blues, but the baby blues are typically just that first, couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's postpartum anxiety, OCD, other types of panic disorders, PTSD. Psychosis is probably the other one that people are most familiar with, because that's the one that probably gains the most attention in its severity. But there's such a scale, if you will, of what somebody may experience with all the hormones going on in their bodies. And as I mentioned, kind of the pre-existing conditions or life events that could play into it. And so, it's really kind of odd, because scientists have not been able to identify a single cause as it relates to postpartum depression. So could you, Rocki, kind of reflect on some of those statistics before I get into generalized anxiety disorder, and then we'll start hearing a bit more about your personal experience?
Well, one of the first things that came to mind is my husband often says that if more women were represented in healthcare, we would get more answers to women's specific issues. And so when you say that scientists haven't been able to figure out a single cause related to postpartum depression, it makes me think that no one is really paying attention to it. And we don't pay attention to it because we're so quick to minimize it, even us as women, right?
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting that if you've suffered some other kind of significant trauma, you're 71% more likely to experience postpartum. That makes so much sense, because I think the trauma is exasperated by the intensity of the situation. And it's interesting, as you were saying that if you have had it before, you're 50% more likely to have it again. And I was just sitting here trying to remember, because the catalyst for me getting my generalized anxiety disorder diagnosis and dealing with postpartum was post the birth of my fourth child.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if I had it before, and now, look, y'all, my kids are in their 20s and 30s, so I'm having to tap back in, but my gut is to say that, if I'm honest, I probably did have it before I had my son, but there were so many mitigating circumstances around my son that I probably just couldn't pull through. And I'm really glad I didn't, because it allowed me to get other diagnoses and really be able to be an active participant in my mental health.
Yeah. And it's so critical, once you do receive those diagnoses, to be able to play that active role and be able to get through it with additional tools in support of counseling or different measures that one may take. So you mentioned also that you have generalized anxiety disorder, and that affects 6.8 million adults, or about 3% of the US population.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. Another kind of sad statistic associated with that is less than 50%. It's about 43% that are actually receiving treatment. And to hit on kind of what you said about scientists and doctors and the lack of woman representation in that field, this is another mental health issue that is twice as likely in women than it is to affect men. So that probably isn't surprising either, based on what we just chatted about.
For sure.
So, Rocki, I had experience with postpartum depression as well. And similarly, I probably had it with my first child, but I didn't get the diagnosis until my second child. My situation was a little different. It was late onset, so it was actually a year postpartum. It was around the time that I was stopping breastfeeding. And I know that created a lot of challenges in being able to bond with my younger son, Oliver. And I'm curious from your perspective, when you received this diagnosis or even leading up to the diagnosis, how did it impact being a mom for
Right.
you?
And I think it's such an important question to ask. And for us, the situation was a little bit different than yours. And I would say to everyone who's listening, know that your situation may not be as exactly like someone else. So just because your symptoms don't manifest the way that someone else does, please don't minimize the fact of that spidey sense when you feel like something is wrong, then please don't ignore that because your symptoms don't look like someone else's. For me, we were in a situational and family crisis when I was pregnant with my son. And so, Erica, you know this about me. I'm really high energy. I'm on the move all the time. I've got 16 million balls that are bouncing. And for various reasons, when I was pregnant with my son, from the time I was 4 months pregnant with him, 5 months pregnant. I was basically told that I was going to be as close to bed rest as you possibly could be.
Oh,
So I couldn't lift more than 5 pounds. Now, I just want you all to remember that at that time I had 3 other children. So I couldn't be on my feet for more than 15 minutes. I couldn't lift more than 5 pounds. I couldn't work. My daily excitement was walking to the end of the street to pick my daughters up from the school bus. And that was the extent of the physical activity that I could participate in. And so leading into having my son, I was severely depressed because that's very different than who I am and how I operate. And
yeah.
then we had another situation compound that. So, of course, at that time, I wasn't able to work. And then my husband lost his job. So now we have, 0 working adults. We have 3.5 children, and I was
Mhm.
already depressed. And so I was dealing with a bout of severe depression, so much
Yeah.
so that during that time, my doctors had recommended that I go on antidepressant meds. And I refused because no one could tell me the implications to the baby.
Yeah.
And so for me, what was the tougher time, and probably the tougher time that impacted me being a mom, was those 5 months of just not really being myself, being severely depressed, not knowing how to do nothing, not knowing how to operate in that, knowing that I was depressed, making a very conscious decision that I felt was in the best interest of what we now know as my son, not to take medication that I was afraid might have implications for his long-term health. So that was a really tough set of circumstances leading into where I was. But
Yeah.
for me, I believed it was a moment in time, right? I believed that when I had my son and we could get to the other side of this, it would be okay. And I got to the other side of it. My son was born a month early. We got through all of that. He was very healthy, by the way. He was 7 pounds, 6 ounces being delivered a month early. So he was going to be a giant. And what's very interesting is then as I'm going to my postpartum, and again, we now have still all this financial pressure.
Mhm.
My husband hadn't found a job, I hadn't found a job. This ultimately led to some pretty um heavy consequences for our family financially. But my doctor was wonderful. She had been our family doctor for years. She had become a friend. She had been at 2 baby showers of ours. And, her commitment was to us. So she wasn't going to stop treating us. She was like, we'll figure out the money later. And so she was amazing. Um,
Yes.
and but then we started to get 6, 9, 12 weeks out from my son's birth, and I wasn't feeling any better. And it wasn't getting any better. And I'm very grateful that it didn't change my bonding with my son. In fact, I leaned into it for those moments. I started leaning into that time with my son and that time with my family to make me feel better. But it was the other hours of the day when I couldn't lean into them that were just so dark. And so I finally went to my doctor. We were on a first name basis. And I just finally said, Linda, something is wrong. I can't come out of this and I need help.
Yeah. Yeah. And, a couple of things that you mentioned, you advocated for yourself and really your unborn son. Right. And I think the empowerment that you had there, even though the situation was quite dark, was huge. So, kudos to you for taking those steps to protect your family. And then you also talked about that being a moment in time. And I just, while none of this is funny by any means, I chuckle only because I think that's something that we tell ourselves often before we get to the place where we're like, okay, you know what, this isn't going away. We actually need help. Like I also remember with my youngest, when he just randomly stopped breastfeeding, there was this sense of rejection there, which is what we think kind of propelled me into more of the postpartum depression. But I remember telling a friend, I think it's just my hormones. I think it's just this moment in time for my hormones. And, let me give it a couple of weeks to see if that stabilizes. It in fact didn't. But I just wanted to point out that it's a good call out for somebody who is going through it, because I think it is okay to say it's a moment in time. But if that continues, there are additional questions and potential help that you should seek out.
Absolutely. It is a critical point. And I think if someone listening to this only hears that, when the moment turns into the minute and the minute turns into the hour and the hour turns into days and days turns into weeks and weeks turn into months, you've got to go get help.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you talked a bit about what getting help to look like. You were in a fortunate circumstance where, your family doctor, Linda, was fabulous to you guys. How else, would you say, like, what did those conversations look like at home, maybe with your husband, before you took the steps to say, hey, Linda, I need help, or even with your family? How did that look?
It's really interesting because now we all have words for things that we didn't have 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it just looked dark for us. I mean, it was lots of circumstances that we were going through. I mean, we were trying to figure out how we were going to keep roofs over our heads and, lights on. And so we just all went into survival mode.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, when you go into survival mode, it gets you through the moment, but then oftentimes you wind up being stuck in survival mode and you don't really realize it. And so that's another thing that I would say to those of us who have dealt with our mental health and have a plan and we are better. Make sure that you've brought yourself out of survival mode. And it took me talking to a therapist to get me there eventually. And it was, it honestly was a couple of years down the road when a therapist looked me in my face and said, you have survived. You're done in survival mode. We need to get you out of survival mode so you can thrive. So I think for me, what it looked like is we just went into taking one step forward the best we could do every day. And I regret that time for my children, right? We certainly weren't the best parents at that time, I don't think, but they've all survived. And I think that's another lesson, is that instead of beating yourself up, because if one of your kids were sick, you wouldn't blame them. And yet, and still, when we're sick, and make no mistake about it, mental health is an illness, then we have a lot of guilt that's wrapped around that, right? Let me tell you, the kids survive. They're all just fine. They are healthy, thriving adults. And because we've made it through all that, and then we've learned to integrate the language and ask questions about mental health, our children are better and they are much more acute about their mental health. I have a daughter that has a mental health crisis. That's not my story to tell. And I'm not going to violate her privacy, but because she saw us go through it, she was able to see that she was having a challenge and quickly advocate for herself and get help. And so I I think with all of this, the other thing I would say is we tend to want to hide these things and we tend to want to go inside of ourselves and we don't want to talk about it. But by talking about it, you can help someone else. You can help the next generation of people have the language and the skills to be able to deal with it more effectively.
Yeah, and there's definitely something to be said about talking about it. That's exactly what we're doing here. So, for our listeners, I just want to re-echo what Rocki said. We oftentimes will go inside ourselves, and it's so important to somehow in the darkest of days when you're, circling feelings of shame and guilt and just hopelessness, that if you can do one thing, and it would be to vocalize where you're at, because then if you don't do that with a medical professional, you could do that with somebody who can help you get to the steps to seek out help, right? So that's exactly what we're doing by raising awareness on this podcast, Honestly Mental, and hopefully providing our listeners insight and the tools to how, by going against our best instinct in those times, to vocalize where we're at.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, and you also, the postpartum depression experience, it led you to the generalized anxiety disorder diagnoses as well. Could you please talk a little bit about that?
It did. And so we realized that ultimately, yes, there was postpartum, but we realized that there were other issues. And here's what seems a little bit oxymoronic. And I'm sure you know this, Erica. When you deal with anxiety, it can manifest as depression. Mm-hmm. And so when you think you're depressed, it's actually a different side of your anxiety. And so it took us a while to figure out that what I was dealing with was not just postpartum, but I was also dealing with generalized anxiety disorder. And so I want to say a couple of things about this, and you may have questions that you want to ask me, but I'm going to put out kind of the generalized my generalized reaction.
Yeah.
So when I got that diagnosis, for me, it was a relief because it made sense in so many ways. It answered so many questions of behaviors and moods that I could see in myself for years. And so for me, it was a relief. I think a lot of times when we get a diagnosis, we like to think of it as a stigma, like someone has branded us. But I think you should think about it as a relief, right? Because you can't deal with the it if you don't know what the it is. And so by naming it and claiming it, then you can take steps forward. And so for me, it was a real actual relief, right?
Yeah.
And then I think we're able to, again, bring language into it. So even now today, I'm very clear when I'm having days where my anxiety is high. And I can say to my family, and especially my partner, my loving husband of now 35 years, hey, look, my anxiety is high today. Right. And so I'm going to need a little bit of grace. I'm going to need some help. I'm going to need some support. I'm going to need some forgiveness. I'm going to need some space, whatever it is that I'm going to need, or I feel like I need. I'm also able to say to my friends, because I do recognize that when I'm having extended periods and battles with anxiety, which don't happen as much as they used to because I have the tools to deal with it, I'm one of those people who would go into myself. So I could also give my friends the notification and say to my friends, hey, look, if I'm not responding to you, I need you to come and get me. Come get me. If you are, if you've called, if you've texted, and it's an odd amount of time that I haven't responded, or you see me going silent, please don't take that as an offense or that I'm ignoring you. It usually means I'm in a bit of trouble and I need somebody to come get me.
Yeah, and that goes back to talking about where you are at with others and creating almost that safety network of individuals to say, this is what's going on with me. While you may not notice it today, if X, Y, and Z happen, I absolutely need your help. And that, I think I do that too. It's a great tool when you still go inside yourself for those people to be aware within your network and your circle to come get you and come seek you out. Right. I think that's hugely important. I think, you mentioned that the diagnosis was also a relief for you. And one of the things that I would also highlight for listeners is just how different Rocki and I's experiences are with our diagnoses, our postpartum depression. You hit on it early on, but everybody handled these things different. And when I got my diagnoses, gosh, I was back in high school and I didn't take them seriously. And it wasn't a sense of relief. It was certainly much more a stigma. I remember I had told friends that I thought were in my circle. And I remember, like, even on antidepressants, like if I had an off day, they'd be like, oh, did you take your happy pills today? And I'm like, okay, well, I don't know that that's helpful, but I don't know that I experienced the same relief. But the silver lining there is you and I both ended up kind of in the same places, eventually coming to terms with, while it wasn't a relief for me initially, you are right. Once you name it and you claim that, then you're able to take appropriate steps. And I'm there now, but I certainly haven't always been. Sometimes I get frustrated with my diagnosis. I don't know if you do this at all, but sometimes I'm just like, why can't I just be quote unquote normal? But, let's just throw that word out the window, because what is normal anyway? But it happens, right? That's kind of the vicious cycle that anxiety can put you in. And when you're experiencing either an episode or feeling down a little bit, or, having one of those more major episodes.
Well, but this is why you have to have tools. And I know we can talk about how I've managed mine, how the evolution of the management of mine have come into place. But to be honest, I've also recognized mine as a superpower. And I know that there's someone sitting out there going, oh, she's stupid. She's just saying that, etc. But when you recognize how your mind works and how it works differently than other people, then you can harness that for your good. And so when I think about, the cycles and what that looks like, I also recognize that I have times of extremely high productivity. That's probably because I'm a little bit anxious, right? And I'm revving. And I ride those waves until I can't ride them anymore, right?
Yes.
I able to produce crazy amounts of work. I also recognize that when I've lost my thought a bit, but it also changes the way I work. So I also recognize that when you deal with anxiety, this is what I was going to say.
Yeah.
It has actually been really good with the work that I do. And so, for someone, this is the way I explain it. I used to tell people this and people would look at me a little bit strange, but it is my experience. When I worked outside of the home and I would call home, and then, I would call my husband and he wouldn't answer. And then I would call the kids and they wouldn't answer. Right. And so in my mind, I've gone from A to Z. The anxiety is kicked out. I go from A to Z. And A to Z means someone has murdered all my kids. They poisoned the dogs to get to the house. They've not only murdered my whole family, but they're setting me up for having done it. These
Yeah.
are how people with anxiety think. We go from A to Z. And then your brain's hopefully, sometimes we get stuck at Z, and that's really bad when we get stuck at Z. But a lot of times you're able to recognize it because Z sounds so ridiculous. And then you throttle down to maybe J. And then guess what? Somebody calls back and says, oh, I left my phone here. Oh, I was in school. Oh, I'm sorry. I was outside cutting the grass. And you realize that your responses were disproportionate. What that's done in my career, because I have been a global talent operations person, is that means I can see problems to Z. I can predict the absolute worst case scenario. And what that's allowed me to do in my career is plan for that worst case scenario. And guess what? 92.7% of the time, worst case is never going to happen. But most people also don't plan for J. So I've not only planned for J, I've planned for Z. And if Z comes up, I've already planned for it. And that's what I mean about things can be a superpower for you as well. One other thing that I will say is I also recognize that with those high times of productivity, there are times when my brain is like, I'm done, I can't move. And so I also know the kind of work that I can get done in those days where my brain is struggling. And so if you don't acknowledge the it, then you can't plan for those contingencies.
Yeah, that's huge. And, I would say, I think I'm going to right now claim my diagnoses as superpowers. Honestly, I had never thought of it that way. But as you were talking about the hypervigilance that somebody with anxiety has in planning for steps Z, I do that same thing at work, and much like you, operationally or, in different scenarios in my career, I'm the one who's always shot holes through different projects or solutions because I'm thinking worst case scenario. I had not necessarily made the connection entirely. I have somewhat because I know that I'm hypervigilant and that's been helpful, but not to the place where I've claimed it as a superpower. So, Rocki, I'm going to do that right now. I think that is huge. And hopefully our listeners can hear how you take that reaction or trait, if you will, from the diagnoses to be able to move from that phase of even in some cases, a victim mentality to surviving, but where we all want to be is actually thriving.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was really good. I thank you for that. So, what in these moments of, darkness, to what other tools might you utilize when you're experiencing heightened anxiety? We've talked about how it's become your superpower. But what about other tools that you might use that would be helpful for listeners to hear?
Absolutely. The first thing I did when I first got my diagnosis is I went on medication. I took Lexapro, and it took some time for me to adjust, and I was on a really low dosage, but it really helped me to balance out. And we got to the point where I was able to wean off and integrate other strategies for coping with my anxiety. And so for me, a big part of that is prayer and meditation. I start every day in prayer. I am an unapologetic God girl. But even if you don't assigned to a particular kind of faith-based system, taking that time to be quiet and really listen to what your mind is telling you, what your body is telling you, can help you deal with the day. So I can always tell the days where I'm going to struggle a bit to focus because I struggle to say my prayers, right? I'm a planner, and I have some very specific prayers that I say every day. And when I find myself not being able to focus and get those words, then I stop and go, okay, God, I see what kind of day it's going to be.
Yep.
I need a little bit of extra help. But that what it does, and mine is faith-based, is if you take that time in the morning and then you recognize, oh, I see what's going on, then you can acknowledge it during the day. I think I've started a yoga practice, and it's so funny. One of my dear friends bought me a custom yoga mat, and on the mat it says, I bend so I don't break. And I thought that was so appropriate for me, because there are days where I bend so I literally don't just feel like I'm going to break or shatter in half. I ride my bike. And look, you all, don't get it twisted. I am not some athlete over here. You may hear me going, I do yoga and I ride my bike. And so, no, look, I am a 54-year-old curvy Black woman with, I'm pretty healthy, but I've got some challenges. But those things are about mental health for me. I don't ride my bike because I'm trying to lose 12 pounds. I ride my bike for the mind release, and it is the best thing I could ever do. And as a matter of fact, I got an e-bike because I could ride longer, and it just makes me feel like I'm a kid again to get out and get that air. Like I said, I use the language. I will say to people, here's where I'm at today when I know that I need help. I, at night, have a whole system that I use. And so while I haven't had to go back on medication, and please understand, I would at any moment that I thought I'd need it, I use Ollie gummies at night. They're incredible. I use like a combination of their sleep and their stress gummies that really help me shut off my mind. I use CBD oil. So there's a combination of things that I have put into place for myself, and that help me stay a little bit more balanced.
Yeah. And so, you have been on this journey for some time now, in a way to offer hope for listeners. What do you think that the timeline of that journey looked like? And I imagine that some of that is continuous work, and you have to always put in the work, right, as it relates to mental health. But what did your timeline look like? When do you think you really started, kind of honing in on your tools and building that really solid toolbox?
That's a really good question. I think your timeline evolves as you do, right? I don't know that I could answer that really effectively, but what I would say is that depending on where you are in your life, depending on the situations that either make it easier for you to manage your mental health or exasperate your mental health, you have to consciously be aware of what strategies work for you. And so it took me a long time. Like, each one of those steps didn't all come at once, right? It was, even breathing from yoga helps, and learning to breathe. And so when I'm in a meeting and I'm completely anxious, so I think for me, I went pretty traditional at first. I went medication, I went therapy. And as a result of having really good therapists and I'm a reader, I'm a geek. And so doing a ton of constant reading and understanding about how to manage, I would try other strategies and see what worked and what was aligned to where I am in my life at the time. So I think it is like any other kind of constant diagnosis that you get. It's a lifetime diagnosis, and you have to actively be managing to it all the time.
Yeah. And, that was probably a bit of a trick question, but it's the trial and error too, in that continuous work. to figure out what works for you, because what works for you may not work for me. What works for me may not work for our listeners, etc. And so the trial and error component of finding those bits that, even when you mentioned riding the bike, I kind of feel like that's tapping into your inner child a little bit. And that could probably be a podcast and another episode in and of itself. So we'll have to reconnect on that. But, yoga stuck out to me as well. I have just started trying out yoga. I'm doing restorative yoga, which has been so great for mindfulness. And, where I'm at in my journey is very much, I'm still figuring out who I am, and what things I like, and so I'm trying to read books, and, I find I enjoy it, but then I almost create more anxiety because I feel like I can't pick up another book until I finish the first book. And anyway, so that may not be my calm, but that's okay, and I think it's an evolution. Absolutely. And in a previous episode, we mentioned and hit briefly on how your toolbox will evolve as you do, and things that work today may not work in the future.
Exactly. And I think the critical thing to remember is, even when you're at the beginning of the journey and you try something and it doesn't work, your bias is to just say, oh, well, see, that didn't work. Forget it. You can't forget it. You have to be an active participant and partner in your mental health. And if one thing doesn't work, you try another, and you try another, and you just keep trying to figure it all out.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rocki, we have gone over how you are extremely successful professionally. You are someone who has had postpartum depression. You live with generalized anxiety every single day. We've talked through different tips and insight, both on your journey, but how you manage your generalized anxiety through yoga, your meditation and prayer in the morning, riding your bike. Is there any other words of advice you might have for others who are experiencing the same thing?
I think it wraps around exactly what we were just talking about. One is, don't feel stigmatized. You're not in this by yourself. To Erica's point earlier, the numbers are probably small and underestimated because we're afraid to talk about it. So I think I would say to people, own your diagnosis, own your partnership in your diagnosis, find those people around you who respect you for who you are, get rid of those people who are not going to be good for you. And that's a pretty tough step, but you've got to get rid of the people who are not good for your mental health. Be an active partner and continue to look at those things that serve you for where you are, and serve your mental health for where you are at this stage in your journey. And just know, it when it changes, when it's off, et cetera, don't wait too long to say, oh, like, I need to figure something out, or, oh, it's time for me to go back into therapy, or, oh, this isn't working and I need to tweak it, because it will happen. There is nothing wrong with you. It is just like everything else in life. Something is evolving and changing, and you need to evolve and change to meet the moment.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think you hit on, to circle back around to one point, you hit on medication management too. And I think I just wanted to note that medication does not have to be forever. It may be for some people, but it may not be. So medication, as scary as that can be, or even affirming of your diagnoses, if you will, it's trial and error too. So you have to stick with it and work with your care team and be an active participant. But I think, as we wrap up today, first, Rocki, I wanted to thank you so much for sharing honestly about your journey, and for your absolute vulnerability as we continue to destigmatize the conversation, and raise awareness about mental health, continue to offer hope to people, and ultimately saving lives. A couple of other elements I wanted to note: if you are experiencing postpartum depression, or you think you are experiencing postpartum depression, there is the National Maternal Health Hotline that you can call, which is 833-TLC-MAMA. So 833-TLC-MAMA. There's also a Postpartum Support International Helpline, and then the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline that you can call or text at 988. Thank you so much for your time today, Rocki.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you for this very important work that you're doing.
I appreciate it. And for those listening, please like, comment, subscribe below, and we'll look forward to the next episode.